Merhaba, hello, guten Tag. So I read this book on killing, and it's probably one of the more fascinating reads I've read in a while. The book deals with the actualities of war as opposed to the theoretical stuff. For example, if you were to think of a general planning to move his troops on a battlefield, well, a sergeant who's actually dealing with his own troops would be facing an entirely different set of problems. Some of the problems that were covered in this book was, for example, not firing. A lot of soldiers did not fire their guns. In fact, there's an interesting statistic where soldiers in the Civil War or in Napoleon's army would have been more efficient at killing with crossbows than they would have been with muskets because because the firing rate of the crossbow was going to be better, but the muskets were louder. And Napoleon can be quoted as saying, he was sure to bring more cannons than the enemy. He was always ensuring that he had more cannons than the enemy. The reason being is because soldiers didn't actually like to fire, right? If there was 480 troops with muskets in a particular regiment, like a little contingent, and there would be 480 troops in one contingent. That's 480 rounds per minute because they fired per minute, and they were accurate at 75 yards. But the statistics for the killing rate back then were about 1 to 2 people a minute, right? And they were accurate at 75 yards, and the battles usually occurred at 35 yards. So a lot of soldiers didn't fire. On top of that, there were muskets that were found that were never fired once, were loaded more than 3 or 4 times, and in some occasions loaded up to 20 times. People didn't like to fire at one another. And that was a very interesting insight here. Another insight was what caused stress casualties, like PTSD. The bombings that took place in World War II of cities like Germany and Britain, they were justified that, well, if we can cause large amounts of stress casualties in the population, we can end the war. Well, what would happen is when they bombed these cities, not only did they not get stress casualties, they weren't even that abnormal after the fact. The stress rates weren't that abnormal after the fact. I think in Germany, the stress casualties were 2% higher than the year before when there wasn't even a war, right? So when people are being bombed, they don't get stress casualties because there's 2 main factors that cause stress casualties. One is the obligation to kill people. Soldiers really, really got messed up from that. They said that the obligation to kill was very, very stressing for them. And the sense that someone was trying to kill them. Okay, so prisoners of war, like say if you were a British prisoner of war in a German camp and you were being bombed, you didn't actually get a stress casualty because you didn't feel like someone was trying to kill you. And that's the same thing with the citizens in Germany and Britain. They knew that they weren't the primary targets, and so they didn't feel like they were that nobody was trying to kill them, and so they had lower rates of stress, lower rates of PTSD. And yeah, also the citizens didn't have an obligation to kill. So yeah, the cities that were being bombed didn't have as much stress as soldiers who weren't even necessarily shooting or fighting. Soldiers who were driving trucks behind enemy lines, soldiers who were flying planes, which brings up another interesting point, which is that this obligation to kill was also modulated by the proximity of a kill. So someone who was dropping a bomb had an easier time killing than someone who had to actually shoot their target because of the distance, not only emotionally but physically from the kill, which is also very interesting. And what was also interesting was he talked about modern armies have ways of dealing with stress casualties by letting soldiers recoup from the battles. So in Vietnam and before, all those wars, like from Vietnam and before, any war fought right then, basically was ineffective soldiers because after 12 days they'd be way too useless due to the stress that was built up in them. But if you could take them and put them behind, like in a safe spot behind the main line for 5 or 6 days, and you could rotate them, then they were more useful. And so modern armies do this rotation thing where soldiers aren't actually allowed to fight for a prolonged period of time. Overall, the book was written really well. There's a bit of repetition, but it's very systematic in how it deals with killing in the army and how people are conditioned to kill in the army and the consequences of killing. what causes PTSD. It's very systematic and it goes over that. It goes over like the proximity of a kill, the emotional intimacy of a kill, the consequences of a kill, how you're trained to kill, what happens to society when you integrate trained killers back into it, mass killings like World War II, World War One, Vietnam, the Civil Wars. It goes over all this stuff. It's very systematic and it's written really well. So for those reasons, I strongly recommend people reading this book. That being said, ciao.